All right, welcome everybody. We'll get going here in just one moment. Can you guys see the screen okay? Is it too light? Because I could turn a little better. Okay. All right. All right, I'm getting chats. People can see and hear fine. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brittany and I'm the coordinator for the Crow Wing County Master Gardener Volunteer Program. We have people both in person at the Brainerd Library today and also on Zoom, and we are recording the session. So we're really excited to have Extension Educator Julie Weisenhorn here joining us today. She's zooming in from the cities, from the Landscape Arboretum. So thanks so much, Julie. Take it away.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. So the topic that we are going to look at is pretty timely. It's on winterizing plants and protecting them from wildlife damage. And I want to just point out that you have a handout there, and then Brittany's also put the link. But also, if you want to see other handouts that I have, you can go to this website, z.umn.edu, Weisenhorn handouts. And I apologize for the length of the name, but married into it, all that. Or you can click on this QR code if you like. And I have a lot of different handouts in this Google folder from all my presentations that I give. And I probably have probably a couple dozen different presentations. So they're all things that a home gardener would be interested in. Everything from winterizing plants to trees and shrubs for pollinators, also creating a pollinator garden. So feel free to click on this QR code, go to this website, and just investigate some of those other handouts along with this one too. I'll have my last slide has this QR code and website on it also. So if you miss it, you'll get it at the end. So let's talk about cold damage to plants. What causes it? So certainly lack of plant hardiness is number one. In other words, what zone am I planting for? Also winter soil temperatures, which can really vary depending on the amount of moisture that you have and the type of soil that you have. A lack of snow cover. Also, we had a really odd winter last year with a lack of snow cover, and that can also be an issue with drought. We also have extreme winter conditions, things like heavy wet snow, get that in the spring a lot. Also ice storms and wind as well. And then de-icing salts, and these are things that we put down on sidewalks and on other hardscape areas that help to alleviate or to melt the existing ice and snow. Let's look at each of these. So hardiness is important, and it's based on the annual average low temperatures that a plant can survive. It's one marker for plant survival. In other words, there's lots of other reasons and ways to choose plants, but we start with the hardiness. We have our plant hardiness zone map from our USDA. And we also want to look at being sure that we match plants' growing needs to the site conditions that we have. In other words, we want to understand what kind of soil we have, how much space we have for a plant, also the amount of light that we have, what kind of plant we want, and we want to be sure that those plant growing needs match the site conditions. And then also our planting practices, we want to put plants in the ground correctly so that they will thrive and not just survive. And then our post-planting care too. So this is watering and pruning and fertilizing and mulching, activities like that. So the influences of winter soil temperatures and lack of snow cover, these are really important to the survival of particularly the roots of the plant. So moist soil will hold more heat than dry soil. and this will prevent deeper frost penetration. So our frost in Minnesota is roughly 42 inches to 60 inches, so about 4 to 5 feet. Sandy, dry soils are going to be colder, and that frost will get deeper down in the soil. A lack of snow cover or mulch can also affect the health of our roots. Snow is 90 to 95% air, and those air pockets are 32 degrees. So it acts as a really good insulator, as does mulch. It helps to moderate our soil temperatures, which makes it much less stressful for our roots of our plants, and they are able to survive the winter better. One example is one of the things I do as an extension educator is I'm on WCCO AM 830, the radio station, talk radio, and we have a radio show on Saturday mornings called Smart Garden. I'm one of a number of people who are on it. And Mark Seeley, our retired climatologist from our soil and water and air Department of Soil Water Quality, he came on one morning, it was minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. And he wanted to point out that based on soil temperature thermometers that we have at our research stations as University of Minnesota, the frost depth of bare ground was down to 22 inches deep. But the frost depth of covered ground, in this case, it was ground that had sod on it, was 0. So just covering the soil will help to prevent that frost from getting so deeply down and thus damaging the roots. So it's kind of an interesting comparison when you look at bare soil versus some kind of covered soil, and how that covering over the soil helps to moderate those soil temperatures, which makes it easier on the roots of plants. So root damage is due to soil temperatures because soil cools down more slowly than air. It holds heat, and moist soil, again, is warmer than dry soil. As the soil is insulated, it enables those roots to survive cold temperatures, but also hot temperatures in the summer as well. So soil temperatures in the winter are going to be warmer than air temperatures, especially if they're covered with some kind of mulch or snow cover. And then likewise, soil temperatures in the summer are going to be cooler than the air temperatures. If you feel the soil underneath mulch, you'll feel a much cooler soil, especially if it's been watered and it has moisture in it. And that will help to be less stressful on those plant roots. And why does this happen? It's because roots are less hardy. They become dormant more slowly than do the stems and the branches and the buds of plants. In other words, the above ground parts of the plants. They will die at temperatures of minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. So we want to keep them protected. And trees do lose some of their roots naturally. They kind of turn back into organic matter in the soil. So they do lose some of those, but we want to preserve those winter roots as much as we can. Our freeze-thaw cycle, which happens primarily in the later part of the winter, this is when we get really cold temperatures and the soil freezes, and then we get a warm-up and that soil thaws out, and it can literally shift and move root balls, like this picture of this arborvitae right down here. You can see the root ball, it's heaved out of the soil, and that's due to the changes in soils due to that freeze-thaw cycle. And what it does is it exposes our roots of our plants. So these roots, remember that roots will die at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have this happen and your plant is heaved out of the soil and then you get a cold snap and it's less than 10 degrees Fahrenheit, those roots are going to die. And of course, that will result in death of the overall plant. So how can you reduce this? What can you do to protect your roots through the winter? The first thing is plant your plants properly. And we have good information on our Extension Yard and Garden page about how to do that. Second of all is protecting roots with 3 to 4 inches of shredded wood mulch. This is for woody plants, so trees and shrubs. If you're planting herbaceous plants like hardy perennials, you can use about 2 to 3 inches of mulch around those plants. This again helps to maintain those more constant soil temperatures, moderates those soil temperatures. It's not as stressful on the plant. And it also helps to hold in moisture as the plant goes into dormancy. And it allows for that more gradual dormancy at this time of year where the plants are going dormant into the winter. And then in the spring, it's the reverse. It allows for more gradual, what we call deacclimation. And this is where a plant is coming out of dormancy. We also want to water regularly through the growing season. Right now, we're kind of encouraging people to be sure to water because we've had such a dry fall. And we're encouraging people to water up until the point they can't. The soil freezes or they've turned off their spigots and irrigation systems. But continuing to water up until frost penetration is a really great practice because, again, you're getting moisture down into that soil, which helps to then keep that soil a little bit warmer around those roots. We also get snow and ice damage, and a lot of times we get heavy snow like in this picture. This is my neighbor's arborvitae, and you can see it's really bent over from the snow. And we also get ice storms in Minnesota, not so much as the East Coast, but we do get some. And these can both end up breaking branches, and that can cause damage. And the plants that are most susceptible are the trees that have poor form. So they have very narrow branch crotches. They have what's called included bark, where two branches have kind of grown together at the crotch area. And then plants that have multiple leaders. And that results from poor pruning. All of those things can be corrected when the plant is young. So if you're planting a tree next year, take a look at it and do some good pruning on it before it gets too old. And you're going to want to keep up on that pruning through the life of the plant. Upright evergreens like this arborvitae also are notoriously susceptible to breakage from heavy snow and ice. And then also clump trees that have multiple stems, multiple trunks, they can also become, those trunks can break off from these kinds of storms. So how do you reduce the snow and ice damage? Pruning properly. As I mentioned earlier, we want to eliminate multiple leaders. This plant that you see, this tree, it's my neighbor's tree, and you can see that it's got 2 leaders. So it was it had 2 leaders growing up when it was young, and nobody went in to prune off that second leader and choose one or the other for the leader. I probably, if I was looking at a young tree, I would choose this leader, this plant initially, because look how straight that stem is, versus this one that's kind of branching off to the side. Now, I should show you a follow-up picture of this because this branch is actually broken off in a storm now. This is an older photo. A lot of times arborists will come in and put in cabling. These are not the cables here, these are phone lines, but they'll put a cable between the 2 of these leaders for this poor form to help hold it in and tighten those leaders and keep them from splitting due to a storm. You can also tie the leaders of plants. So on smaller plants and smaller trees, you can tie things, kind of use twine or rope. You can wrap trees also with, say, burlap. And this helps to keep those weak crotches together to help to protect them if pruning isn't an option. So this would be a plant that maybe it's too late to actually choose a leader. It's gotten too big, hopefully, but you're doing good pruning when you put plants in the ground. And then in the spring, you would remove all of that. So we have an excellent web page, and it's in the information. It's called Hiring a Tree Care Professional. So this is a really good kind of a primer for how to hire somebody to come in and take care of your trees. Kind of the questions to ask, gives you definitions of what a tree care professional will do, and also ways to find a tree care professional in your area. And then we have damage in the winter from something called de-icing salts. This is sodium chloride. It's a manufactured product. And the negative effects on the environment are due to quality of water quality, due to the runoff that we get. So de-icing salts work by dissolving or warming and melting the ice or snow that's, say, on steps or a sidewalk or a driveway. What happens is that they mix into that runoff water, this melting ice or snow, and it can run off into areas where we don't want it to be, such as in ditches where we grow plants, or sometimes into garden beds especially. This can build up soil in the salt in the soil, and then also that can be picked up and absorbed by the plant. And ultimately that can damage foliage too. It can also damage roots as well through desiccation or drying of those salts. Once you get chloride into water, sodium chloride, you can't get it out. So we want to prevent using or try not to use de-icing salts in areas by natural waterways. And we always want to follow the directions. So how do you reduce salt damage? Well, clearing the snow off as soon as possible. Get out there with your shovel or your snow blower, clear it off your steps, clear it off your driveway. Hopefully the sun will dry up any excess water, and then follow the application instructions. In this picture, you can see a big pile of de-icing salts on these steps. This is the wrong way to use these. In the case of de-icing salts, more is not better. So we want to follow the directions, apply the minimum amount needed. If you put granules of de-icing salts too close together, they contradict each other. It doesn't work well. And so more is not better. And avoid spreading salt on grass and also in ditches where that water can collect. Remember, we don't want water flowing off into areas of sensitive plants. You can consider using alternative de-icing salts like calcium chloride and calcium magnesium acetate. They work a little differently than the sodium chloride. So you want to be sure that you read the instructions on those as well. If you have damage to your plants, like this picture, you see these junipers that have been damaged by salt spray. This is coming from cars going by on the road or a snowplow spraying as it plows. We can get salt damage that way as well. Excuse me. And so we want to maintain good plant health throughout the year to help these plants recover. So that means watering that plant correctly, pruning it correctly, fertilizing it once it starts growing in the spring and you see new growth, mulching it to protect the roots, all these things that help it to kind of de-stressify the plant. In other words, the plant is in a better position, it's going to perform better, and it's going to be able to outgrow that damage to its foliage. You can also plant salt-tolerant plants near roads and walkways. So these are like Ohio buckeye and Austrian pine, maybe some white oaks. And then avoid planting any salt-sensitive plants and woody plants too close to streets where you get that salty runoff, where it collects, and also that salt spray. Sometimes people will put burlap barriers up. They'll wrap a plant if it's too close to the road, or they'll maybe make a fence out of burlap to catch any spray. The important thing is that don't plant salt-sensitive plants near roads where they're so close. In this case, in this picture, this is pretty close for these evergreens to be alongside the road, and they're really not in the right place. They should be pushed further back into the property. So not really, it's a good idea, the wall and everything, but it should be pushed back further onto the property to avoid that salt spray from hitting the plant like this. And just remember that no species of plant is completely salt tolerant. They'll all have some effect, but some can outlive the salt damage better than others. Okay, animal damage. Brittany, are there any questions about salt or any winter damage that I could answer now?
We don't have any in the chat. Any questions in the audience? All right. Keep on
Okay.
rolling. Thanks, Julie.
All right, you bet. So then we also have animal damage that causes plants. I bet everybody who's listening to this has had some kind of animal damage on their plants. So wildlife, they feed on twigs, bark, buds, leaves, stems, pretty much every part of the plant. Deer come in and they'll scrape the tree trunks, rubbing off the bark and rubbing into the cambium layer, which is right below the bark. That's an important part of the tree because that's where all of the, I'll call them the vascular system or the vessels of the tree exist that help to transfer nutrients from roots up to leaves and from the leaves down to the roots. Wildlife may also eat shrubs completely to the ground. They might girdle trees and shrubs, chewing through that bark that breaks through that vascular system, and it interrupts those kind of the pipes of the plant from getting those nutrients and water back and forth. So your best overall strategy is going to be physical barriers. Let's look at some of these pests. Voles and mice cause damage. They're little guys. They're food for predators like eagles and hawks. They burrow under long grass and they stay in places where they're protected. They don't want to be out in the open because then they'll be too easy for the raptors to find them. They will girdle plants by chewing through that bark and then that cambium layer, leaving just the heartwood of the plant. Here's an example down in the lower picture. This is a creeping juniper. You can see the foliage and you can see the damage that the little guys have done down here, whether they be mice or voles. And you can see the damage here to the foliage. It's all yellow because it's dying because it doesn't have that vascular system bringing nutrients back and forth from the roots. Rabbit damage. Rabbits are a little bit bigger. Of course, they too like to be hidden away in brush piles, under shrubs as well, under decks. And they have those big front teeth that create these 45-degree cuts. So when you see a branch cut, a beautiful 45-degree cut, that's a rabbit damage. They, like the voles and mice, will also chew the bark off of branches. And you can see in this picture, this is a euonymus, and you can see the issues that are down here, this light tan color. That's where the rabbits have been feeding. See how high it goes up? That's because that's where the snow was. So they were able to feed down below, and they could also feed up a little bit higher as the snowfall came in. So they could sit on top of that snow a little bit. They can cause some real damage. They are voracious feeders, and they've chewed off all the bark here. So if somebody showed me this picture as an extension educator, I'd say, you know, you got to really just watch that plant. You might be able to prune some of these branches off, but to be honest, a lot of them have been destroyed by that bark and that vascular system. So they've really girdled those plants. So in this case, I would probably do some pruning, hopefully keep some of the plant, some of the stems. Might also need to take it down to the ground if that plant will tolerate that. And then we have deer damage. So no plant is deer proof. Deer will eat anything at least once if they're hungry enough. They feed on the terminal, in other words, the top stems, tops of trees like white pines or spruce trees. And then they also nip off the side branches of small trees and shrubs as well. Then they also cause damage by rubbing and scraping. So they rub their antlers and their foreheads on trees. They'll break through that bark, they'll rub it off, and they'll get down into that cambium layer as well. And of course, it's a protected game species. So we can't be out eliminating them just because they're feeding. So we have to do something else. We have to protect our plants from them. Some examples of deer damage. Here's an arborvitae. You can see the damage is up in this area. And they're working on this. They've done a really, really good job at chewing through this plant. Here we have some branches that are poking out from beyond the fencing. So here's someone has put fencing in here, but they didn't create a big enough fence, a wide enough fence. And so some of these branches that have been growing out or poking out of that have been chewed off by deer. And then down here we have, this is river birch. And you can see what the scraping and the rubbing has done to this river birch. We've gotten right down to the heartwood. And this tree will definitely die. It's completely girdled around the side. It has no cambium layer left, and the deer have rubbed this completely off. Here's another tree where they haven't damaged it. See the difference. So how can you reduce damage caused by wildlife? One of them, a big one, is physical barriers. So for rabbits, mice, and voles, we want to protect especially the lower branches and the trunk of the tree, because that's, of course, where the animals reside. They're little guys. We use hardware cloth. So this is a picture of hardware cloth. It's really sturdy. It can't be chewed through. And we want to create these hoops that are wider than the plant. We have a little plant in here. This is a New Jersey tea plant. It's a little seedling that we planted here at the Arboretum. And we created this fence around it. It's a nice big hoop. It's plenty far away from the little plant. And we also cut down into the soil and sank. We put the fencing down into the soil, a couple, 2-3 inches, and then use some staples, some landscape staples, to just hold that fence in place. We also included some rebar to give it strength. And this is a pretty good protection for this small plant. For rabbits, we want to think about the height. So voles and mice are pretty small. Digging that fencing down into the soil is going to be helpful. They're not going to be able to tunnel underneath it very easily, and it will eliminate any gaps that might be the case between the fencing and the mulch or the soil surface. But rabbits are taller. They can jump a little higher. And so we want to think about how tall our fencing should be for a Minnesota winter. And we recommend at least 4 feet tall, because we have to think about the snowfall. And if we have 2 feet of snow, those rabbits are able to sit on top of that snow. And if you only have a 2-foot fence, they can jump right into the fence and start feeding on the plants. So we want to make sure that we get nice high fencing, at least 4 feet. If we get a lot of snow like we did 2 winters ago, and we had 4 and 5 feet of snow, sometimes we have to go out there and extend that fencing, put another row of fencing, and you can zip tie those together so the rabbits can't break that down. But we need to think about how high is our snowfall going to be. Usually, if you have a 4-foot high fencing in Minnesota, that usually works pretty well. But if you get more snow than that in your area, then you'll want to put 6 or even 8 feet around those plants. For deer, we also create physical barriers. One thing that can be done, let's say you've planted a lot of new white pine in your property, and you've got some younger trees, you can do what's called bud capping. This is a picture of that. It's simply taking a 4 by 5 inch piece of copy paper, so nothing fancy, white bond paper, or something maybe you're going to recycle, and you can fold it around the terminal bud of the plant. So this is the top of the tree, and just staple it there, just staple it, and it will stay on like a little cap and protect that tree from deer coming along and biting off that terminal bud of that plant. What happens is when deer do feed on these and they nip these off, then the plant is prompted to put up 2 liters or even 3 liters from that cut point. And that will result in a multiple liter tree, which is not a very healthy tree from a design standpoint, or the way the tree looks, the form, and also can cause some of those pruning issues that we saw earlier. You also want to create fences for deer. You want to exclude them from an area. The minimum should be 8 feet high around individual or groups of plants. So if you have a yellow birch, we have one out here at the Arboretum right out my window, and we have a big fence around that. It's reinforced with rebar. It's also buried down in the ground a little bit, and then it's and that's 8 feet tall. So that will protect the tree from any deer jumping into that fence because it's small, but also they can't reach the tops of the trees. So that tree stays really well protected through the winter. You want your fences to be well constructed. Don't use chicken wire because deer will bash that right down. You can use electric cattle fencing. So you can give them a little zap if they reach into your beds. And then you can do something called micro enclosures. This is a picture that you see here. It's well constructed, strong fencing, cattle fencing. It's got fence posts around it. It measures about 16 by 16 feet square. And that is an area that is too small for the deer to feel comfortable jumping into and being able to escape in the case of a threat. This was a research project that was done in conjunction with a farmer over in Wadena, and it seemed to work out really well. The researchers were able to zero in on a size that was big enough to protect a lot of plants, but not big enough to allow any kind of comfort for that deer to jump in and out.
Julie, there was one question in the chat.
Sure.
On somebody had their irises unearthed already by rabbits. What would you recommend that they do yet this year to protect them?
So this year, if you can get them back in the ground, if you have that opportunity, your soil hasn't frozen, try to nestle them back in. And then I would fence those, put a fence around those so the rabbits can't get back at them. It could have been also some other animals too, digging those up, but that's what I would do. If you have any parts of the rhizome that has been chewed off, you could consider taking a nice clean knife and cutting that off too before you put it back in the ground.
Great, thank you.
You bet. So the other thing to do around your property is make it inhospitable. Don't make a nice inviting place for these critters. You want to eliminate protective cover. So this would be if you have big brush piles, say in the back of your property, or you've been meaning to burn that burn pile. Now is a good time to do that if it's permitted. And you also want to eliminate grasses that are growing around the base of trees. So remember that voles and mice in particular like to be protected, and they will climb under and crawl under that grass, and then they'll start to chew on the bark of your tree. So you can see in this picture that area has been cleared out, and so it's much more open, and the smaller animals are not going to be comfortable in this space. They're too exposed. Also look for areas like under decks, walkways, other structures that you have, play areas, and maybe think about protecting that with also fencing so that it doesn't create a really nice place for rabbits or other animals to take up residence. You can use repellents. So repellents are things, they work on neophobia, which is the fear of anything new or unfamiliar. They are not poisonous to animals. They work solely on bad taste and bad smell. A lot of repellents that we use in landscapes are either putrid egg solids or garlic, or sometimes a combination of the two, or hot sauce. People also use that. They're really good for small areas. Excuse me. They're good for small areas, or if you're building a fenced area, kind of like temporary control. You can spray or paint them on trees and shrubs. And one application is going to work for your entire dormant season, so your winter. Here's a picture of an apple tree. This is in our home demonstration garden. And you can see it's been painted with kind of this green repellent to repel animals. This is a mixture of latex paint with a fungicide and also a little bit of water and some hot sauce. So this is used by our plant health specialist, Aaron Buchholz, here at the Arboretum. And this has been proven to repel animals. They don't like the taste, especially of the hot sauce. If you are going to use repellents during the spring, you want to start with those repellents, applying them early in the season. And then change up your repellents. So start in April when things are warming up, apply the repellents to your plants, and then 3 weeks later or after rain, change it to something else. So there's a lot of different repellents out there you can use, but you want to keep the animals guessing. So don't use the same repellent like plant skid or some of the others. Don't use that same repellent all season. Change it up with other repellents. So keep them guessing through the season. Okay, so any questions on animal damage? Got anything, Brittany?
There was one more question on if straw mulch attracts pests.
Well, any mulch is going to be a place where animals could tunnel. Straw is lightweight, so they can tunnel under it pretty easily. In that case, I know a lot of people use straw as a mulch around over bulbs and whatnot. If you are protecting, say, spring blooming bulbs that you planted, you're going to put a layer of mulch or garlic, as is our case here. You can lay the mulch down. You can also put down, before you put the mulch down, you could put down chicken wire, and you can leave that in place. You can use landscape staples again to staple it down, make it nice and firm and flat. And you can leave that in place for the growing season, and your bulbs should come up between the chicken wire areas, and it will prevent squirrels and other animals from digging out your bulbs. You can try that. It's not a fail-safe method, but it's better than if you have a lot of squirrel issues digging up tulip bulbs and other edible bulbs. It's better than having them ruin all of your plantings. Okay, let's look at evergreen damage. So we have here a yew. This is a yew hedge, beautiful evergreen, really great one, but it's got a lot of what we call winter burn on the tips. And we're going to look at how that happens. Here is where the snow line was. So we had snow. Remember that snow is a good insulator. And this, we can see how tall the snow was, how high it was, because anything that's exposed was afflicted with winter burn. But all of this lower area that's nice and green was covered up by snow. So let's see how that works. With evergreens, we either have browning, like in the previous picture. We also have burning, which is similar to the other picture too. And then we have bleaching as well. So sometimes it's due to the plant's susceptibility. So transplants, in other words, newer plants that you put in, the yew, like you saw in the previous photo, arborvitae are susceptible to this sometimes, and also hemlocks. Plants with succulent late season growth can also experience burning, browning, or bleaching because that foliage hasn't acclimated. When we prune late in the season, where we make those cuts, a plant possibly could put out a number of new branches of growth from that point where you made the cut. And that new growth is not likely to harden up before we get really cold weather. So we stop pruning in August or even the end of July, depending on where you live. And because we want our plants to not have that new growth going into dormancy season, going into the winter, in other words. Sometimes winter sun and wind can also desiccate foliage, can dry out foliage. And because the soil is frozen, the roots have no ability to take up any water at that point to help replenish that. And de-icing salts, which we looked at earlier, also can cause a drying or desiccation of foliage. So how does this work? We have bright, cold winter days. So that sun is intense and it can warm up the tissue, warms up the needles, and initiates what we, cell activity. So those cells start working. And the chlorophyll is moving around. That's the green part in the tissues. And then because it's winter, the sun sets early and goes behind a building or behind some other plants, and the temperatures drop rapidly. And that will kill the chlorophyll, which causes the bleaching. They don't have any green left in those leaves or stems. So here's a picture of boxwood. This is bleaching, and this is caused by what I just described, where the chlorophyll is destroyed and it can't resynthesize itself. So you get this bleaching like this, or burning too, browning. So how do you prevent this from happening? So keeping evergreens sufficiently watered up, through the whole growing season and then up until soil freezes. They have to hang on to all those needles or all of those leaves, as in the case of the boxwood. And then don't prune any plants after August or even late July. So we don't want to promote that new growth. That's not going to be able to harden up before it gets really cold. Some people have used anti-desiccant or anti-transparent sprays. These are used ordinarily when a landscape company is moving a tree in hot, dry weather. They'll spray the foliage so it doesn't, kind of protects it temporarily, so it won't dry out between trips, on the road. You might see those big trees in the spades, with a tree spade, or wrapped up as a ball in burlap. And the foliage of those trees will get sprayed when it's hot to help them prevent them from drying out. Well, it doesn't really work that great in the winter, so we don't recommend it for that. Also, you can reduce discoloration by planting your evergreens in the right place. Minimize that winter sun exposure. So put your plants on the north and northeast sides of buildings. These are particularly your yews and your hemlocks, because they can tolerate some shade. Also cover or protect evergreens. Sometimes people will wrap them in burlap or a similar material. I'm not real fond of this because it looks really odd in the winter landscape to be staring out at burlap trees for the whole season. So it's better to be sure that you're planting plants far enough away or on the right side of the building or far enough away from the street to prevent any salt spray from reaching them as well. When you've had the evergreen injury, you see this foliage, like this picture here of this yew branch. You see the needles are brown, they're dead, but look at the branch and check for buds. Here we have some bright green new buds that are going to be the foliage for this coming growing season. If the buds are alive, then the branch is alive, the stem is alive. So you can just take off the minimum amount of dead branch at this point. You can also scrape that branch a little bit with your fingernail, bend it to see if it's still flexible. That'll tell you that it's still alive. So in other words, don't cut this all the way back, assuming that thinking that you're getting rid of that, but just trim as little as possible so you're going into the growing season with more stem tissue than otherwise. And then reduce plant stress as well. So during the growing season, mulch your plants, fertilize these injured plants early in the spring when you start to see these buds open up and the new growth happening, and then being sure to get enough water throughout the growing season. All those things will help reduce the stress on the plant, and the plant will be able to recover from the evergreen injury that has occurred. Okay, so that's evergreens. Let's look at deciduous trees. Primarily, we have an issue called sun scald. And this is similar to winter burn, except it happens on deciduous trees and particularly the trunks of trees or large branches. This is, again, really cold winter days. That sun comes out, it heats up the bark and stimulates that activity. And then the sun sets or goes behind a building or some trees, or in other words, now the plant is shaded and that bark temperature drops really quickly and it can cause a crack called a frost crack. And here we have a picture of one. This is a maple tree that's out in one of our evaluation sites here at the Arboretum. And we also have a little bit of mower and weed whip damage down here, which doesn't help, but you can see this big long crack that's happened due to sun scald. We also have, this is most susceptible when we have younger trees, newly planted trees, and trees that have thin bark, like the maple that we saw. Also cherry and crabapple, honey locust. Older trees have thick enough bark that it keeps that tissue dormant, doesn't allow it to heat up. In other words, it's kind of insulating the tissue under the bark. Trees that have been limbed up or pruned up, they're exposed to more sun on their trunks. And then any trees that have been transplanted, in other words, change the light that they're growing in from a shady to a sunnier location. Those are all plants that are susceptible to this. So how do you prevent sun scald? You can use what's called a tree guard. And here you see it, a white tree guard. The white color reflects the light, so it helps to keep the temperature of the bark underneath the guard consistent with the rest of the tree. So it's keeping it dormant, it's keeping it cooler because it's reflecting any kind of sun that's going to heat up that tissue. And you can leave these on in the spring. You can take them off. They help also with animal browsing. In other words, it reduces some of the chance of animals chewing on the bark as well. We don't recommend brown paper tree wrap. That's an old product. It's almost like crepe paper in rolls, and we would wrap it around the trees, but it's dark brown. And so it would actually hold heat. Sometimes it would also hold moisture and cause mildew on the plants as well. So we don't recommend any dark guards or dark tree wrap. If you have sun scald damage on plants, typically the tree will heal on its own. In other words, the inner bark will kind of regrow and it will grow along the edges of that split. You can help it along by promoting really good tree health through fertilization, watering, mulching, good pruning practices at the appropriate time during the year. In some cases, you may feel inclined that you're concerned about your tree. Maybe an arborist has recommended repairing the damage from the frost crack. In this case, you'd use a sterilized sharp knife. You'd remove any dead bark. Maybe that's starting to have issues, and to reveal that live tissue and just leave that wound uncovered. Sometimes a fungicide may be recommended if a tree is susceptible to that. Also, if you notice a frost crack in a young oak that has happened, that you're coming out to check out your new plants in April and you notice a big frost crack on a young oak that you planted last year, that would be a case where you'd want to put it on a wound dressing. It could be latex paint, it could be a commercial wound dressing, because we don't want to endanger that plant to oak wilt. Oak wilt is the highest risk for oak wilt is from April through mid-July in Minnesota. So we don't recommend any pruning of oaks during that time. And so if you have this wound, this open wound that's new, you'll want to cover that up on an oak tree. We also have winter dieback. Most affected are going to be shoots and buds of deciduous trees and shrubs, and particularly flower buds like this forsythia that you see here. Beautiful plant, early spring. And here we have a comparison. So this was out at our Forsythia cultivar trial a number of years ago. And here on Forsythia cultivar A, you can see we have beautiful blooming, but all of it's down at the bottom of the plant near the ground. Here we have no blooming in the upper parts. And here we have Forsythia cultivar B that's in full bloom. It looks fantastic. What's happened is that this is where the snow line was. So the snow is protecting these branches down at the bottom. And that also protected and insulated the buds, the flower buds. So when it melted, at that point, the buds could emerge. But the rest of the plant was out in the open during the winter and the buds could not survive the cold temperatures. So this is what we would call a non-hardy or not reliably hardy cultivar. And then also we have a fully hardy cultivar. All parts of this plant are hardy. This plant, cultivar A, isn't dead. The roots are fine, but the buds cannot survive the cold. So you can minimize this. If you have existing plants that this happens on, you can't do much about it except protect it physically. You may have to make a decision on whether you are tired of protecting that plant or it's just not living up to your expectations. Then you would want to choose a new plant for that location. So you would want to first pick for your hardiness zone. Make sure you get a fully hardy cultivar, plant it properly, provide really good care during the establishment. In other words, as the tree becomes accustomed or the shrub becomes accustomed to the new site and the growing season. And then also locate any marginally hardy plants. So if you really, really want to try a plant that's kind of questionable in your area, think about putting it in a sheltered location. We call it a microclimate. It's maybe out of the wind, maybe it's in the shade, maybe it's just a protected space where the plant will not be so subject to the really cold winds of Minnesota winters. And then avoid encouraging growth in the late summer. Don't prune late summer. Prune in the at the appropriate time, and then fertilize your plant when it starts actively growing in the spring as well. And in the spring, you'll want to prune back any of that dieback. We have some really good shrub pruning videos on our Extension Yard and Garden webpage that gives you some good examples of pruning. We talk about tools and timing of pruning as well. All right, so now let's see how we did. So those of you who are online, you're welcome to put your answers to these questions in the chat. And Brittany, I don't know if you want to kind of read them off as they come in. And then those of you who are watching this in person, maybe you want to just talk amongst yourselves and come up with an idea, or think about it in your own head and what you think causes some of these issues. So this is a hemlock, eastern hemlock. And the question is, what caused browning on this eastern hemlock? What's most likely? Is it winter burn, sun scald, or deer browsing? Let's give everybody a minute or two here.
So let's see, we have a winter burn in the chat. We had a couple people say sun scald in person. Somebody said C in the chat, deer browsing. So we're a little bit across the board.
Okay, well, the answer is actually winter burn. And remember that hemlocks are sensitive to winter burn. Yews, hemlocks, they need to be growing in a somewhat protected area. And winter burn is what occurs on evergreens, whether they're broadleaf or coniferous. And so in this case, this is winter burn damage. And its sun scald occurs on deciduous plants. So remember, that's where you get frost cracks from the sun heating up the trunk tissue or on big branches of the plant as well. So this is winter burn. Okay, next one. What animal browsed this shrub? In other words, chewed on this shrub. And here's the damage. You can see it's kind of tan colored. It's down here at the bottom.
Let's see, I see a rabbit in the chat. A couple people saying rabbit. In person, everybody's guessing rabbit.
Okay, you are all correct. It definitely is the rabbit because we're seeing it low to the ground. And it doesn't go very high. If it was deer, it would go much higher, and they probably wouldn't get down to this point. All right. Aside from the chewing, in other words, the stuff that's happened to the stems, what else do you see here that would tell you what kind of animal was feeding on this, browsing this plant?
Everybody's saying C. They're seeing the feces.
Yep.
Now, I didn't notice it before you said it. And after you said it, I was like, oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, sometimes you have to play detective when you're trying to figure out how to take care of a plant. But yep, definitely we see a lot of rabbit poop down here. This, by the way, makes a good compost. You can put in your compost bin. All right, so there's more than one answer here. So please think about all that apply. Here we've got a tree, and it's definitely time to re-fence it or re-protect it, create a new protection for it. So what of A, B, C, D, and E are you going to do as you create a new fence around this this tree to protect it for the winter?
Let's see, we have an ADE in the crowd. We have an A in the chat. Another ADE in the chat. An AD in the chat. ADE.
Okay, everybody's got the right idea. So A, D, and E are the answers. We want to create a taller fence because we are thinking about snowfall and how high we should make our fencing. We also want to leave a gap between the fencing and the trunk. We don't want to girdle the plant. And if we tighten it tight around the trunk, chances could be that a small animal might climb up that fencing and then, chew on that plant up above it. So we want to leave a gap. And we also have here with a tree, we have a root flare. So that's the wider area. And so to try to put a fence in at that point is almost impossible. So we do need to bring it out further away so that we can actually bury it down a couple of inches to prevent voles and mice from getting into that space. So y'all had the right idea. Okay, we've got sun skull damage and frost crack. Here it is. It's a really, really long one. And so if this was a tree that you saw, what do you think you would need to do to help this tree?
Yep, we have an A in the chat. People in the crowd are saying nothing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's correct. Nothing, it will heal on its own. This one is a fairly shallow crack too, which is good. You might paint it with latex paint or a wound dressing if this were an oak and this was a new crack from this past winter. So again, we want to protect oaks from oak wilt, and the high risk time for oak wilt is April through mid-July. We don't want to prune oaks, and if we have any wounds like something like this, or if somebody banged into it with an ATV or something, you'd want to protect that plant by using a wound dressing on it, especially that first year. Great. Okay, here we've got a yew hedge along a garage area, and you can see the top branches here are all brown, but why are the lower branches still green, the lower needles?
We have some C's in the chat and we have people saying C in the crowd as well.
Great. You are correct. Yeah, that's where the snow level was. That's the snow line. So we see some of the old snert over here. But yeah, the snow was that high this winter and just the tops of these got burnt. This is probably on the south side of the house. And so that winter sun is pretty intense on the south, and that caused winter burn to occur. Good job. Okay, last one. Who or what caused this damage? And we're looking at the bottom of the tree down here.
Let's see, we have a couple B's, I think I heard a C maybe. I see a B in the chat. Couple B's in the chat.
Okay, good job. It is indeed careless lawn care. And there's this, what happens is the mower comes around here and has to mow up tight, or a weed whipper. Somebody brings their weed whip out and they've broken through the bark. They've damaged it that way, banging into the tree. So the really easy thing to do, mulch the tree. Put down a nice big 6-foot ring of mulch. That makes it much easier to mow around your trees without damaging them. And you don't have to come back with a weed whip and trim around them and risk doing something like this. So good job. Everybody did an awesome job. So winter protection starts with planting location and also your plant care. You want to provide good plant care. Timing of care is really important. So thinking about, doing all your pruning at the appropriate time, not waiting, not doing it later in the season when that new growth might start to, might start to grow and not harden off before winter. And then winter damage is due often to lack of moisture in the soil, where you put the plants, salt damage, and animal browsing. And barriers are going to be your best way to protect plants from sun scald. Remember the tree guards that you can put around the trunks, and then also animal damage as well. So here's that link to the handout and also the QR code if you want to snap it with your phone if you're looking at this. And we have just a few minutes, I think, if there's any last questions.
All right, thank you, Julie. We have a question in the crowd. Go for it.
Great.
Not to do with trees, but I put in new above ground strawberry containers this summer. How
Okay.
do I prepare them for the winter?
Okay, so the question is she put in above ground strawberry planters and she's wondering how to protect them for the winter.
Okay. It's always risky above ground because you don't have that soil protecting the roots. So what you could try with those containers, I don't know what shape they are or anything, but you could put a hardware cloth fencing around them, making sure it's tall enough to, taller than the containers. And then you could pack it with leaves or you could pack it with straw. And that would probably protect the plants from excessive cold, like drying winds. If we have any ice storms, excessive snow, would protect the plants that way. And then in the spring, you could just take the fencing off and just peel back the straw and use it for mulch or compost it.
Thank you.
She says, thank you,
Welcome.
that was helpful.
Okay.
Any other questions? One more in the crowd.
I need it since mulch. And I thought that was one of the preferred ways to mulch.
Okay, the question is on pine needles for mulch. Are they a good recommended mulch or not?
They're an excellent mulch, especially if you have a lot of them. And they allow a lot of air to get down to the soil, but they also allow a lot of moisture too. So they're a great mulch. They're nice and fine. They're not the star of the show in your landscape. They show off other plants really well. So yeah, if you've got pine needles at your disposal, they make a great mulch.
All right, great, thank you. Any other questions online or in person? Let's see, I'll check the chat one more time. All right, I think, oh, we do have a question.
So we're getting a little bit of mulch, but it's not mulch in my case. It's, they're falling all over the place and you just don't pick them up, they kill the grass. So is that the acid in the pine needle?
Okay, the question is on, she has a lot of pine needles. They're not mulch, they're just falling on the ground and they do kill the grass. Do you know what would be causing the grass to die out? Is it acid, she suggested?
No, because it takes so long for those pine needles to break down that they would have to be there many, many, many years to change the soil pH. But that being said, your soil pH itself might be different. You may want to do a soil test. That would be a good one. But if those pine needles are super thick, they're probably shading out the grass plants. And you'll want to rake them up and then use them as mulch around the base of plants like shrubs or trees, or throw them in the compost. So they're probably shading it, but they're probably not, the pH of the needles themselves are not probably affecting the grass necessarily. But a soil test would be good to do.
Sounds good. She's taking notes.
You might have an acidic soil that needs to be adjusted that with lime or something like that, or use a different type of grass seed. And we have a really good publication that came out, a webpage on how to buy grass seed for Minnesota. So that's on our extension site under a lawn care, under yard and garden.
Okay, so extension.umn.edu and then.
Right. Yep, go to yard and garden
Yard
and
and
go to
garden
lawn
and-
care.
search
Yeah.
under- yeah,
It's a
okay.
great publication.
All right, well, we sure learned a lot today, Julie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, you bet.
Really appreciate it. I know you're a busy lady, so thank you.
Thank
Have a-
you.
Applause, so,
Yep. Thanks,
And next-
everybody.
all right, great. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks for
Bye.
joining.